Little Leaders, Bold Women in Black History, Vashti Harrison, Part 1, pages 2 through 10. Phyllis Wheatley, circa 1753 through 1784, poet. Phyllis's literary skills were apparent early on. She published her first story when she was only about 14 years old. For anyone, this would be a major feat, but Phyllis was a slave, so it was truly unique. Her original name, date of birth, and exact birthplace are all unknown. When she was only 8 years old, she was taken from her home in Africa and sold to a trader, then transported across the Atlantic to Boston, Massachusetts, aboard a ship named the Phyllis. She was then resold to a man named John Wheatley, who purchased her to be a personal servant to his wife. The Wheatleys soon recognized her intelligence and began to nurture it. They taught Phyllis everything from theology to mythology, an education that was rare for a woman and nearly unheard of for a woman of color. With the family's backing, she traveled to England to publish her first book, poems on various subjects, religious and moral. She was the first African-American woman poet ever to be published. She corresponded with George Washington and famous French writer and philosopher Voltaire, who called her a master of English verse. Her work was so powerful that abolitionists used it as an example of the intelligence and promise of Black people. In 1767, she was emancipated. Unfortunately, she struggled financially and lived in poverty for the rest of her life. She received a great deal of praise during her lifetime, but validation from white society was integral to her success, and it never came. She continued writing, but was not able to find a publisher in America. Her natural talent and body of work live on as fundamental contributions to American literature. Sojourner Truth, circa 1797 through 1883, abolitionist, women's rights advocate. Sojourner was born a slave in upstate New York under the name Isabella Baumfree. Under the state's Gradual Emancipation Act, she was due her freedom in 1827. When she realized her slave owner was planning to keep her enslaved, Sojourner ran away with her infant daughter in tow. But this came at a huge cost. She had to leave behind her 5-year-old son. The slave owner sold Sojourner's son to a plantation 1,000 miles away in Alabama. Meanwhile, Sojourner remained in hiding in New York until her freedom was official. When the coast was clear, Sojourner filed a court case saying her son had been sold illegally. She was one of the first Black women to file a court case in America, and even though it seemed nearly impossible, she won. She got her son back. In 1843, she changed her name to Sojourner, which means traveler, and became a preacher. She traveled the country sharing her messages for women's rights and the abolition of slavery everywhere. Although Sojourner could neither read nor write, her voice carried far. In December 1851, she gave a speech that she made up on the spot. In it, she advocated on behalf of Black women who faced the double discrimination of racism and sexism, and had often been left out of the fight for equality. The speech is known by its most famous refrain, "Ain't I a woman?" She went on to encourage African Americans to fight on behalf of the Union in the Civil War, for former slaves to be given places to live, and for desegregation of streetcars. She was an agitator and a fierce activist for equality. Harriet Tubman, 1822 through 1913. Abolitionist, nurse, scout, spy. One of 9 children, Harriet was born into slavery under the name Aramita Harriet Ross. Both her parents were West Africans. hailing from the Ashanti warrior people. While many of her siblings were sold and traded to distant plantations, one good fortune Harriet had was to remain united with her parents throughout her youth. When she was 15, Harriet was accidentally hit in the head with an iron weight and fell into a coma for 3 days. Her brain injury resulted in narcolepsy, a permanent disorder that caused her to fall asleep at random times. Fearing her slave owner would eventually discover her injury, she decided to run away to avoid the risk of being sold or traded. After escaping to freedom in 1849, Harriet could have stayed in the North, but now that she knew it was possible to escape, she wanted to return for her family and anyone else she could rescue. Over the course of 11 years, she returned to the South 13 times and led more than 70 men, women, and children to freedom and safety via the secret system called the Underground Railroad. Known as a conductor, Harriet never lost a passenger on her journeys. Even though it was dangerous, Harriet continually put her life at risk to save others. It wasn't the last time. During the Civil War, Harriet served as an Army nurse and went undercover as a spy for the North. Harriet was always looking to help other people. What very little she had, she gave away to others. She lived in poverty most of her life and donated her time, money, and property to people in need. In 2016, the U.S. Treasury announced a historic proposal to change the $20 bill. It would replace the longtime face of it, Andrew Jackson, with Harriet, making her the first woman on the front of any U.S. paper currency. Rebecca Lee Crumpler, 1831 through 1895, physician. From the very beginning, caring for others was a part of Rebecca's life. She was raised in Pennsylvania by her aunt, who provided health care services to the people in her neighborhood. This passion for helping her community became her life's mission. She attended a private school in Massachusetts and went on to work as a nurse for 8 years. In 1860, she applied to an all-white medical school, the New England Female Medical College, a bold and risky move, but she was accepted. Rebecca graduated in 1864, becoming the first African-American woman physician in the country. Out of more than 50,000 physicians in the United States at the time, only about 300 were women, and Rebecca was the only Black woman. She began her practice in Boston, specializing in the care of women and children. But when the Civil War came to an end, she moved to Richmond, Virginia, to work with the Freedmen's Bureau. The fallen Confederate South was extremely hostile to the newly freed slaves, so Rebecca worked with the Bureau to provide health care to them. Rebecca had been born free in Delaware, the state with the highest number of free Blacks before the war. She was new to the adversity and racism of the South, but she endured it for the sake of helping the poor and needy. Throughout her career, Rebecca had a particular passion for helping women and children. In 1883, she published a 2-part text titled A Book of Medical Discourses. The first part focuses on care for infants, and the second part on women's health. It is possibly the first medical article published by a Black woman. Thank you for listening, friends. This was Little Leaders, Bold Women in Black History by Vashti Harrison, Part 1. Stay tuned for Part 2.